Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. The Curse of the Red Moon. Have you ever looked up at the sky and wondered if there's something staring back at you? Something that waits for the perfect moment to reveal itself when the world is most vulnerable? I used to think that such thoughts were nonsense, just a product of an overactive imagination. But that was before the night of the red moon, before everything changed. I'd never been the superstitious type. Red moons, blood moons, whatever you want to call them, just another rare celestial event for people to gawk at, maybe snap a few pictures for social media. At least, that's what I thought. The night it all began felt ordinary enough. I had been sitting on the couch in my small, cozy living room, mindlessly flipping through TV channels, as I often did to unwind after a long day at work. I had the window cracked open slightly, letting in the cool October air, when a local news segment caught my attention. The rare red moon will be visible tonight, the reporter said, standing in front of a backdrop of the city skyline. According to astronomers, this is a phenomenon that occurs only once every few decades, so be sure to take a look if you can. I glanced at the clock. It was just after 9, and the moon was supposed to reach its peak around midnight. Despite my initial disinterest, something compelled me to go outside and take a look when the time came. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the eerie way the reporter smiled as she spoke, as if she knew something the rest of US didn't. I shrugged off the odd feeling. After all, what could possibly happen under a moon, no matter what color it was? By the time the moon began to turn red, I was already standing outside on my porch, clutching a warm cup of coffee between my hands. The air was still, almost too still for a fall night. There were no rustling leaves, no chirping crickets, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you aware of every little sound, like the faint hum of electricity from the streetlights or the soft crunch of my shoes on the gravel as I shifted my weight. I craned my neck to look up at the sky, where the moon had taken on a deep, unsettling crimson hue. It wasn't like anything I had seen before. The red wasn't the vibrant, fiery kind that you'd expect from a sunset or autumn leaves. No, this was darker, like the color of dried blood. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt a strange unease creeping into my chest, like something was wrong but I couldn't quite place what. It was just a moon, I kept telling myself. Just an illusion caused by light passing through the Earth's atmosphere. Science. Logic. Things I could understand. But as I stood there, something else began to happen. At first, it was subtle, like a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. I turned my head sharply, expecting to see someone or something in the yard, but it was empty. A chill ran down my spine, and I pulled my jacket tighter around myself. Maybe it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dim light. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced around again, and that's when I noticed the shadows. They were long, far longer than they should have been given the light cast by the street lamps. And they were moving, slowly, almost imperceptibly, but they were moving. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe I was tired or seeing things, but when I opened them again, the shadows were still there, twisting and stretching in ways that defied logic. I swallowed hard and took a step back toward the house, my heart beginning to race. "It's nothing," I muttered under my breath. "It's just shadows." probably a trick of the light. But deep down, I didn't believe my own words. Something was wrong, horribly wrong. The wind picked up suddenly, sending a gust of cold air across my face, and I shivered. The rustling sound of leaves finally filled the air, but it wasn't comforting. It was frantic, like the trees themselves were warning me to get inside. I hesitated for a moment longer, my gaze fixed on the darkened street in front of me. And then, just as I was about to turn back to the door, I saw it. At the far end of the street, illuminated by the eerie red glow of the moon, was a figure. It was barely visible at first, standing completely still, almost blending into the shadows. But as I squinted, trying to make out its shape, it began to move. Slowly, deliberately, one step at a time. My breath caught in my throat. The figure wasn't walking normally, it was gliding, as though its feet didn't even touch the ground. Its form was cloaked in darkness, but there was something about the way it moved that sent a wave of cold terror through me. I instinctively took a step back, my heart pounding in my chest as the figure drew closer. I wanted to move, to run back into the house and lock the door behind me, but I couldn't. I was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer wrongness of what I was seeing. The figure stopped just outside the circle of light cast by the nearest street lamp, and for a moment, everything was still again. The wind had died down, the leaves were silent, and even my own breath seemed to have stopped. And then, the figure took another step forward, finally coming into the light. My heart dropped into my stomach. It wasn't human. I'll never forget the way it looked. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a hollow void, a black, swirling mass where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. Its body was thin, unnaturally elongated, draped in tattered, shadowy rags that seemed to move on their own as though they were alive. And yet, despite its monstrous appearance, there was something disturbingly familiar about it, like I had seen it before. Or maybe, like it had seen me. It didn't make a sound as it hovered there, staring at me with its empty, void-like face. But I could feel its gaze, cold and unrelenting, piercing through me like a knife. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body refused to listen. All I could do was stand there, helpless, as the figure slowly extended one long, skeletal hand toward me. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the figure stopped. It tilted its head, as if listening to something I couldn't hear, and then, without warning, it vanished, disappearing into the shadows as quickly as it had appeared. For a moment, I stood there in stunned silence, my mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it? Was it some kind of hallucination brought on by the strange light of the red moon? But before I could even begin to process my thoughts, I heard a voice, a whisper, soft but unmistakable. I spun around, searching for the source of the voice. It wasn't coming from inside the house, and there was no one on the street. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up as the whisper echoed again, closer this time, as if it was right next to my ear. Come closer. The voice was barely audible, but its tone was sharp, cutting through the stillness of the night. I couldn't tell if it was male or female, young or old. It was just there. A disembodied whisper carried by the wind, but with a purpose, like it knew exactly who I was. I took a step back, my eyes darting from side to side. Who's there? I called out, my voice trembling more than I'd like to admit. No answer came, only silence. The figure was gone, but the weight of its presence still hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. I backed up toward my front door, my hand fumbling for the handle, my heart racing. All I wanted was to get inside, away from whatever was out there. Suddenly, a loud bang erupted from the side of the house, like something had struck the wall. My breath hitched, and I spun around, expecting to see another shadowy figure, but the yard was empty. The wind had picked up again, howling through the trees like a distant scream. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I needed to get inside. Now. With a trembling hand, I flung open the door and stumbled into the house, slamming it shut behind me. The familiar warmth of the living room should have been comforting, but it wasn't. The house felt wrong, as if a strange, otherworldly presence had followed me inside. I stood frozen in the doorway, my ears straining for any sound, any sign that I wasn't alone. For a long moment, there was nothing. Just the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen and the ticking of the old grandfather clock in the hallway. I exhaled slowly, trying to calm my nerves. Maybe it was all in my head. Maybe the strange light of the red moon had just messed with my perception, and the figure was nothing more than a trick of the shadows. Maybe the whisper was the wind, and the bang was just a branch hitting the side of the house. My mind was scrambling for any logical explanation, anything to convince myself that I wasn't losing it. But then, I heard it again. Come closer. This time, the voice was inside the house. I froze. My legs felt like lead, and every instinct screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move. The voice was so close now, so intimate, like a breath on the back of my neck. My skin prickled with fear. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to turn around and face the empty room. Nothing. No one. Just the flickering light of the TV and the faint glow of the red moon filtering through the window. Who's there? I demanded, trying to sound braver than I felt. My voice was shaky, barely above a whisper. Still, no answer. The house was as silent as a tomb, but I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the same cold, malevolent presence that had been outside. It was watching me, waiting. I took a cautious step forward, my eyes darting to every shadow, every dark corner. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling as I swiped at the screen. I needed to call someone, anyone, just to hear another human voice, but as soon as I unlocked the screen, the phone died. The screen went black, and no matter how many times I pressed the power button, it wouldn't turn on. Panic surged through me. My heart raced, and my breathing quickened. I was completely cut off, isolated in my own home. The soft ticking of the clock in the hallway suddenly seemed deafening, each second pounding in my ears like a drum. I swallowed hard, trying to think, trying to figure out what to do. I could go outside, get in my car, and drive, but where? Where would I go that the thing wouldn't follow? It had found me here. It could find me anywhere. As I stood there, paralyzed by fear, I noticed something strange. The shadows in the room, the ones cast by the flickering light of the TV and the dim glow of the moon, were shifting. At first, I thought it was just the trick of the light again, but no. The shadows were moving. Slowly. Deliberately. They twisted and stretched across the walls and floor, converging in the center of the room. I watched in horror as they began to take shape, forming the same figure I had seen outside. The same hollow, faceless figure. I stumbled back, my back hitting the wall as I watched the shadows coalesce into something solid, something real. The room grew colder, and the air around me felt heavy, oppressive. My breaths came in shallow gasps as the figure stepped forward, its long, skeletal hand reaching out toward me. It moved slowly, almost lazily, like it knew there was no point in rushing. I was trapped. No, I whispered, my voice barely audible. This can't be happening. But it was. The figure came closer, and with each step, the shadows around it seemed to writhe and pulse, as if they were alive, feeding off my fear. Its face, if you could call it that, was still a swirling mass of darkness, an endless void that seemed to draw me in, suffocating me with its emptiness. I pressed myself harder against the wall, desperate for a way out, but there was none. The figure was inches away now, its hand outstretched, its cold, unseen gaze fixed on me. I could feel its presence pressing down on me, crushing me under the weight of its malevolence. And then, just as its hand was about to touch me, it stopped. Everything stopped. The figure stood frozen, its outstretched hand mere inches from my face, its swirling void of a face staring into my soul. The shadows around it stopped moving, the air around me grew still, and for a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, without warning, the figure began to dissolve, fading back into the shadows from which it had come. Within seconds, it was gone, leaving me standing alone in the darkened room, my heart pounding in my chest, my mind racing to comprehend what had just happened. I collapsed to the floor, my legs unable to support me any longer. The silence returned, but it was different now. Heavier. Darker. The kind of silence that makes you question everything you thought you knew. I sat there, huddled on the floor, my back pressed against the wall, trying to steady my breathing. The silence was unbearable. Every creak of the house made me flinch, every shadow seemed to move in the corner of my eye. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Was I losing it? Had I imagined the whole thing? No. I knew what I had seen. That figure, that thing, had been real. I felt its presence, the cold, the weight of its gaze. It wasn't something my mind had conjured up. But how could something like that exist? How could shadows come to life and form, whatever that was? I rubbed my eyes, trying to clear my head, but the images wouldn't leave. That faceless void, that hand reaching out to me, it was burned into my mind. I needed to get out of the house. I needed to leave. But where would I go? Would it follow me? And what if I left and it came back? The thought of that thing roaming my house while I wasn't here sent a chill down my spine. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs shaky, and stumbled toward the hallway. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed louder than ever, each tick like a hammer pounding in my skull. I stared at the clock, watching the second hand move in slow, deliberate circles. It was almost midnight. Something about the time felt wrong, like the clock was ticking down to something. My eyes flicked to the front door. I could leave now, drive far away, but would it make a difference? Would I be safe? As I stood there, paralyzed by indecision, a faint sound caught my attention. A soft, rhythmic tapping. At first, I thought it was just the clock, but no, it was coming from somewhere else. Somewhere deeper in the house. I turned my head slowly, my heart rate spiking. The tapping was faint, but it was there, steady and deliberate. It sounded like footsteps. Light, almost cautious, but unmistakable. They were coming from the upstairs hallway. I froze, my mind screaming at me to run, but my body wouldn't move. The footsteps grew louder, closer, until I could hear them clearly. Something, or someone, was walking upstairs, pacing back and forth. My throat tightened as the realization hit me. I was supposed to be alone. Hello? I called out, my voice cracking with fear. I knew it was a stupid question. Whatever was upstairs wasn't going to answer me. The footsteps stopped abruptly, as if they had been waiting for me to speak. The silence that followed was even worse than the noise. I stared up at the ceiling, waiting, listening, my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, suddenly, the footsteps started again, but this time they were coming down the stairs. Slow. Deliberate. One step at a time. Each creak of the wooden stairs sent a wave of terror through me. It wasn't human. Whatever was walking down those stairs wasn't human. My legs finally obeyed me, and I backed up into the living room, my eyes glued to the hallway. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I could hear a faint whispering, like the one I had heard earlier. It was the same voice, urging me to come closer, beckoning me toward it. But I wasn't moving. I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, too terrified to even breathe. Then, the figure appeared at the top of the stairs. It was the same shadowy silhouette, the same hollow, faceless presence. But this time, it wasn't alone. Behind it, more shadows began to form, crawling out of the darkness, shaping themselves into twisted, grotesque figures. They moved like smoke, shifting and writhing, their bodies barely solid. Some had long, thin arms that dragged on the floor, others had faces contorted into grotesque, eternal screams. I backed up further, my breath coming in shallow gasps. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But the figures kept coming, descending the stairs slowly, methodically, as if they had all the time in the world. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house, but my body wouldn't cooperate. I felt like I was in a nightmare, trapped in place, watching the horrors unfold in slow motion. The lead figure, the one I had seen outside, stepped forward. It reached out its hand again, just like before, but this time there was no hesitation. It wanted me, and it wasn't going to stop until it had me. I stumbled back into the kitchen, my hand frantically searching for something, anything to defend myself with. My fingers closed around a kitchen knife, and I held it out in front of me, shaking. I didn't know what I was going to do with it. Could you even hurt something like that? The figure didn't slow down. It kept coming, the shadows behind it twisting and writhing like they were alive. I raised the knife higher, trying to steady my grip, but my hands were trembling so badly that I could barely hold onto it. The figure reached the doorway to the kitchen, its swirling, void-like face turning toward me. I could feel its gaze on me, even though it had no eyes. It was like it could see straight into my soul. "Stay back," I screamed, my voice breaking. But the figure didn't stop. It stepped into the kitchen, its hand reaching for me again. I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged forward and slashed at the figure with the knife. The blade passed through it like it was cutting through air, meaning no resistance at all. I stumbled forward, nearly falling over as the figure remained completely unfazed. It was like the knife didn't even exist to it. I backed up against the counter, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I was out of options. I couldn't fight it. I couldn't run. The figure loomed over me, its hand just inches from my face, the swirling darkness of its form seeming to grow denser, more suffocating. I closed my eyes, bracing for the inevitable. But just before it could touch me, the shadows recoiled, retreating suddenly, as if something had driven them back. I opened my eyes in disbelief. The figure was gone. The kitchen was empty, the oppressive weight in the air lifted, leaving me standing there, knife in hand, completely alone. For a moment, I couldn't move. I just stood there, trembling, waiting for the figure to return, but the house was silent again. The only sound was the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway. I dropped the knife to the floor, my legs giving out as I collapsed onto the cold kitchen tiles. I stayed on the cold tiles for what felt like hours, my back against the cabinet, my knees pulled up to my chest. The terror was still thick in the air, clinging to my skin like a second layer. I could barely breathe. Every breath felt shallow, as if the house itself was pressing down on me, suffocating me under its weight. The figure had vanished, but that didn't mean I was safe. I knew that much. It wasn't gone for good, it was lurking, waiting for its next move. But why had it recoiled? What had stopped it? I forced myself to stand, using the counter for support. My legs were still shaky, my hands trembling uncontrollably. I glanced around the kitchen, expecting to see shadows creeping along the walls, but the room was still. I couldn't hear the footsteps anymore. It was like the house had returned to its eerie silence, the kind of silence that felt far from comforting. I needed to leave. Now. My hand reached for the kitchen door leading to the backyard. If I could just get outside, get to my car, I could drive far away from this nightmare. But as my fingers touched the doorknob, I froze. The moon. It was still there, hanging low and ominous in the sky. The blood-red hue seemed to pulse, like a beating heart, casting an unnatural glow over everything. It wasn't just a rare celestial event anymore, it felt like a gateway. A portal that had opened something dark and ancient. I knew I couldn't escape under that moon. Whatever was happening, it was tied to this night, to this blood-red moon. I backed away from the door, my chest tightening with a growing sense of dread. Where could I go? What could I do? I was trapped in my own home, surrounded by shadows that weren't shadows and whispers that weren't meant for human ears. Suddenly, the light above me flickered, and I jumped, my heart racing. The entire house seemed to tremble, as if something had stirred beneath the floorboards. I stared at the ceiling, listening, waiting for whatever came next. And then I heard it, voices. Faint, distant, but unmistakable. They weren't coming from outside. They were inside the house. In the walls. I pressed my ear to the kitchen wall, straining to hear them better. The voices were hushed, like whispers carried on a gust of wind. At first, I couldn't make out any words, but the more I listened, the clearer they became. It was chanting. Low, rhythmic chanting, as if a group of people were gathered somewhere nearby, performing some dark ritual. The words were foreign, ancient, twisted in a way that made my skin crawl. My pulse quickened as I realized the voices were getting louder, closer. I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest, but the chanting followed me, echoing through the walls, filling the house. I didn't know what to do. Panic gripped me, threatening to swallow me whole. I had never felt so helpless, so completely and utterly powerless. The chanting grew louder still, more urgent, more insistent, until it felt like the entire house was vibrating with the sound. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The voices weren't just in the walls anymore, they were in my head, filling every corner of my mind with their dark, incomprehensible words. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I lowered my hands slowly, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. I glanced around the kitchen, half expecting to see those shadowy figures standing behind me, but the room was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe whatever had caused all of this had finally passed. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a small movement in the reflection of the window. I turned my head slowly, dread pooling in my stomach. It was back. The figure, standing just outside the kitchen window, staring at me with those hollow, empty eyes. But it wasn't alone this time. Behind it, more figures had gathered, their shapes twisted and grotesque, barely human. They hovered in the air, their forms flickering in and out of existence, as if they were caught between this world and some other, darker place. I stumbled backward, knocking over a chair in my haste. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the figures slowly drift toward the house, their bodies moving unnaturally, as if they were weightless. They were walking, they were floating. I turned and ran, my feet pounding against the hardwood floors as I fled toward the front door. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get out. To escape. But as I reached the hallway, I stopped dead in my tracks. The door was wide open, and standing in the doorway was the figure. The first one. The one that had started all of this. Its faceless head tilted slightly, as if it were watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. Behind it, the other figures loomed, their shadowy forms stretching out into the darkness beyond the door. I backed away slowly, my heart racing, my mind scrambling for a way out. I couldn't go outside. I couldn't stay inside. I was trapped. The figure took a step forward, its hand reaching out once again, the shadows behind it swirling and twisting, as if alive. Why? I whispered, more to myself than to the figure. What do you want? The figure stopped. For a moment, it didn't move, didn't react. And then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, I heard it. The same whisper I had heard earlier, but this time, the words were clear. It's time. Time? Time for what? Before I could process what was happening, the shadows lunged forward, consuming the figure, consuming the doorway, consuming everything. I screamed, but the sound was swallowed by the darkness as it rushed toward me, engulfing me in its cold, suffocating embrace. The darkness swallowed me whole, and for a brief, terrifying moment, I was weightless. My body felt like it had been ripped from the physical world, suspended in a void that was neither light nor dark, neither here nor there. It was a place beyond understanding, beyond reason, where the laws of nature had no meaning. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't scream. I couldn't feel anything but the crushing weight of the void pressing against me from all sides. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, it was over. I gasped, stumbling forward as my feet found solid ground again. My knees buckled, and I collapsed onto a cold, hard surface. The air was thick and heavy, but I could breathe. My lungs ached with each ragged breath I took, but at least I was breathing. I was alive. But where was I? I pushed myself up onto my hands and knees, blinking against the dim light that surrounded me. The world was hazy, shifting, like I was looking at everything through a fogged-up window. Shadows danced along the edges of my vision, and the air felt cold, damp, like I was deep underground. I looked around, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of my surroundings. I was no longer in my house. I was in a room, a large, cavernous room with walls made of rough stone. The ceiling stretched high above me, lost in the shadows, and the only light came from a flickering torch mounted on the far wall. This place felt ancient, forgotten, like it had been carved out of the earth centuries ago and abandoned. But it wasn't abandoned now. I wasn't alone. As my eyes adjusted to the dim light, I saw them. Figures. Dozens of them, standing in a circle around me. They were dressed in tattered, hooded robes that obscured their faces, but I could feel their eyes on me, watching me, waiting. The air around them seemed to shimmer, as if they weren't entirely solid, like they were caught between this world and something else. My mouth went dry, and a wave of nausea rolled through me as I realized what they were. They weren't human. They couldn't be. I staggered to my feet, my back pressing against the cold stone wall as I tried to distance myself from them. But no matter where I turned, they were there, surrounding me, their hollow, faceless heads tilting slightly as they watched me. One of them stepped forward, and the rest parted to let it pass. It moved with an unnatural grace, its feet barely touching the ground as it glided toward me. My heart hammered in my chest, and I pressed myself harder against the wall, wishing I could disappear into the stone. It stopped just a few feet away, and for a long, agonizing moment, it simply stood there, staring at me with those empty eyes. Then it raised one skeletal hand, and in a voice that sounded like the whisper of the wind through dead leaves, it spoke. "It is time." Those words again. The same words the figure in my house had said before the darkness took me. But time for what? I shook my head, my voice barely more than a broken whisper. "I don't understand. What do you want from me?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it extended its hand toward me, its long, bony fingers reaching out. I flinched, pressing myself harder against the wall, but there was nowhere to go. I was trapped. Its fingers brushed against my skin, and the moment they made contact, a surge of cold shot through my body, freezing me to my core. I gasped, my breath coming out in ragged, icy puffs as the cold spread through me like a poison. And then I saw it. Flashes of images, memories that weren't mine. A fire burning in the distance. A red moon hanging low in the sky, its blood-red light casting long shadows over a group of hooded figures gathered in a clearing. They were chanting, their voices low and rhythmic, just like the voices I had heard in my house. In the center of the clearing stood an altar, carved from black stone. On the altar lay a figure, bound and struggling, their face twisted in fear. The chanting grew louder, more frantic, and the red light of the moon seemed to pulse, growing brighter, more intense. And then, with a final cry, the figure on the altar went still. The chanting stopped, and the red moon flickered, like a dying flame. The hooded figures stood in silence, their faces hidden in shadow, as the blood-red light of the moon bathed them in its eerie glow. The images faded as quickly as they had come, leaving me gasping for breath, my body trembling from the cold. The figure in front of me withdrew its hand, and I stumbled forward, clutching my chest as I tried to regain my balance. I didn't know what I had just seen, but it felt real. Too real. Like a memory buried deep within me, waiting to be uncovered. But it wasn't mine. It couldn't be mine. The figure took a step back, its head tilting slightly as it watched me, as if waiting for something. The rest of the hooded figures remained silent, their hollow eyes fixed on me. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came out. I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. All I knew was that I needed to get out of here. I needed to escape. But how? Before I could think of a plan, the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. The stone walls shook, dust and debris falling from the ceiling as the entire room seemed to quake. The hooded figures remained still, unaffected by the tremors, but I could feel the air growing colder, heavier, like something was coming. Something worse than the figures that surrounded me. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, like the growl of a distant storm, and I looked up, my heart racing with fear. The ceiling was splitting open, a crack forming in the stone as the tremors grew more violent. And through the crack, I could see it, the blood-red moon. It was directly overhead now, its ominous glow seeping into the room, bathing everything in its eerie light. The hooded figures began to move, raising their arms toward the moon, their voices rising in unison as they chanted in that same ancient, twisted language. The air around me crackled with energy, and I could feel the pressure building, pushing against me from all sides. The hooded figures were performing some kind of ritual, and I was at the center of it. But why? What did they want with me? I had to get out. I had to. The ground gave way beneath me, and I fell. I fell into the darkness, my body plummeting through the air with nothing to grasp onto. The wind rushed past me, howling in my ears, but I couldn't see where I was falling or how far it would be. My heart pounded in my chest, my mind scrambling to understand what was happening. The room, the hooded figures, the red moon, they were gone. And now, I was alone, falling endlessly into the void. Just as the panic began to overwhelm me, I hit the ground. Hard. The impact knocked the wind from my lungs, and for a moment, I lay there, gasping for breath, my body aching from the fall. But the ground beneath me wasn't hard stone like before. It was soft, like grass. Slowly, painfully, I pushed myself up, blinking against the darkness. I was no longer in the cavernous room. I was outside. The red moon still hung in the sky, casting its bloody light over the landscape around me. But this place was different, familiar, somehow. I was in a clearing, surrounded by trees that stretched high into the night sky. The air was thick with fog, swirling around me like a living thing. And in the center of the clearing, not far from where I had fallen, stood an altar. The same black stone altar I had seen in the vision. My blood ran cold as I realized where I was. This was the place from the memory, the place where the hooded figures had gathered beneath the red moon. The place where they had performed the ritual. And now, I was here. I took a step back, my eyes darting around the clearing. The hooded figures weren't here, but their presence lingered in the air, heavy and oppressive. The trees seemed to close in around me, their gnarled branches twisting in the moonlight like skeletal fingers. I could feel something watching me from the shadows, something ancient and malevolent. I had to leave. I had to get as far away from this place as possible. But before I could move, I heard a voice. Low and raspy, barely more than a whisper, but unmistakable. Help me. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. The voice came from the altar, from behind the thick fog that clung to the ground. I took a step closer, my body trembling with fear. The voice sounded weak, desperate, like someone barely clinging to life. Please, help me. I inched closer, my eyes fixed on the altar. The fog shifted, parting just enough for me to see a figure lying on the stone. It was a man, bound by thick ropes, his body bruised and battered. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror as he struggled against his restraints. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat. Who are you? The man's eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, I saw pure, unfiltered fear in them. They're coming. You have to help me. Please, before it's too late. Before I could respond, a cold gust of wind swept through the clearing, carrying with it the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps echoing through the fog. I turned, my heart racing as the hooded figures emerged from the shadows, their forms barely visible in the thick mist. They moved silently, their hollow eyes fixed on the altar as they advanced, their black robes billowing in the wind like dark, tattered wings. The man on the altar struggled harder, his voice rising in desperation. Please, don't let them take me. You have to stop them. I stumbled back, my mind racing. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know how to help him. But I couldn't just stand there and watch as they took him. Not again. I looked around, searching for something, anything that could help. But there was nothing. Just the altar, the fog, and the red moon looming overhead. The hooded figures were getting closer now, their eyes glowing faintly in the moonlight. The chanting had begun again, that same low, rhythmic sound that sent chills down my spine. I could feel the energy building in the air, crackling like static electricity. I had to do something. I couldn't let them take him. Without thinking, I ran to the altar, grabbing the ropes that bound the man's wrists. I pulled with all my strength, but the ropes were too tight, too strong. They wouldn't budge. The man let out a cry of pain, his body convulsing as the hooded figures drew nearer. Please. They're almost here. You have to hurry. I pulled harder, my hands burning from the rough ropes. But it was no use. The ropes wouldn't give. The chanting grew louder, more intense, and the ground beneath my feet began to tremble again. The red moon pulsed overhead, its light growing brighter, more sinister. The hooded figures were only a few feet away now, their hollow eyes fixed on the man. I was running out of time. With one final, desperate pull, I yanked at the ropes, and they snapped. The man collapsed onto the altar, gasping for breath as the ropes fell away. I grabbed his arm, pulling him to his feet. Come on. We have to go. But as we turned to run, the ground beneath us erupted in a blinding flash of red light. The hooded figures had reached the altar, their hands raised toward the sky as they chanted in unison. The energy in the air was suffocating, pressing down on us like a physical force. And then, from the center of the clearing, a figure emerged. It was massive, towering over the hooded figures like a giant. Its body was shrouded in darkness, its form barely visible in the red light of the moon. But its eyes burned with an intense, otherworldly fire. A demon. The man let out a scream, his body trembling with fear as the demon stepped toward us. Its footsteps shook the ground, each one sending a shockwave of energy through the air. The hooded figures knelt before it, their chanting reaching a fever pitch as they bowed in reverence. I grabbed the man's arm, pulling him away from the altar. We have to go. Now. But it was too late. The demon raised one massive hand, and the air around us exploded in a deafening roar. I was thrown back, my body slamming into the ground with a force that knocked the wind from my lungs. The world spun around me, and for a moment, everything went black. When I opened my eyes, the man was gone. The altar was empty, the ropes that had bound him now lying in a heap on the ground. The hooded figures were still there, their hollow eyes fixed on me as they stood in silent anticipation. And the demon, it was standing over me. It looked down at me with those burning eyes, its face expressionless, but I could feel the malice radiating from it. This was it. This was how it was going to end. But then, something unexpected happened. The demon spoke. You are not the one. Its voice was deep, rumbling like distant thunder. And in that moment, I realized something. It wasn't after me. It had never been after me. The man on the altar, he was the one they wanted. And now, he was gone. The demon turned, its eyes scanning the clearing as if searching for something or someone. The hooded figures remained silent, their heads bowed in submission as the demon let out a low, guttural growl. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the demon vanished. The red light of the moon flickered, and the hooded figures began to dissolve into the fog, their forms fading like smoke in the wind. I was alone. I lay on the ground, trying to process what had just happened. The demon, the hooded figures, the man, it all seemed like a twisted nightmare, yet I was wide awake. My body trembled, adrenaline still coursing through my veins, but the world around me had fallen into a deafening silence. The red moon was still hanging in the sky, but its light was no longer as overwhelming. It was dimmer, less intense, like the power it had unleashed was fading. I slowly got to my feet, my legs shaky and weak. The clearing was empty now, no sign of the hooded figures or the man. The only thing left was the eerie silence and the thick fog that still swirled around the trees. For a brief moment, I considered running, just getting as far away from this cursed place as I could. But something held me back. There were too many unanswered questions. Who was the man? Why had they taken him? And what had the demon meant when it said, "You are not the one"? I couldn't leave without understanding the truth. As I stood there, catching my breath, I noticed something glinting in the dim light of the moon. It was on the ground, near where the man had been lying on the altar. I walked over, my curiosity overcoming my fear, and knelt down to examine it. It was a small, metal pendant, shaped like a crescent moon. The surface was worn, as if it had been handled many times over the years, and strange symbols were etched into it. They looked like ancient runes, but I couldn't decipher their meaning. I picked up the pendant, turning it over in my hand. As soon as my fingers touched the cool metal, a shiver ran down my spine. It felt wrong, somehow, like it didn't belong in this world. But there was something else, too, a faint sense of familiarity. As if I had seen it before, or at least something like it. The pendant must have belonged to the man. Maybe it was the key to understanding what had happened. Without thinking, I slipped it into my pocket and started walking, leaving the altar behind. I wasn't sure where I was going, but something inside me, some deep, instinctual pull, was guiding me. The fog thickened as I moved deeper into the forest, the trees growing denser and more twisted. The moonlight barely pierced through the canopy now, casting long shadows that danced along the ground as I walked. Every sound, the rustling of leaves, the snap of a twig, made my heart race. But it wasn't just the eerie silence or the oppressive darkness that unsettled me. It was the feeling that I wasn't alone. That something, or someone, was watching me from the shadows. I stopped, my breath hitching in my throat, and strained my ears. There it was again, that soft rustling, like footsteps, but too slow and deliberate to be an animal. My eyes darted around the forest, searching for the source, but I saw nothing. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling despite my attempt to sound brave. No response. Just the same rustling, closer now. I took a step back, my pulse pounding in my ears. My instincts were screaming at me to run, but my legs felt frozen in place. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it, a shadow, moving between the trees. It wasn't one of the hooded figures. It was smaller, more human in shape, but there was something wrong with it. The way it moved, jerky, unnatural, like it didn't belong in this world. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Show yourself." The figure stepped out from behind the trees, and my blood ran cold. It was the man from the altar. But he was different now. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, once filled with fear, were now empty, hollow. He stared at me with a blank expression, his lips parted slightly as if he were about to speak, but no words came out. I took a step back, my heart pounding. How are you here? What happened to you?" The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his body swaying slightly as if caught in some invisible current. And then, slowly, he lifted his hand and pointed toward the pendant in my pocket. I pulled it out, holding it up for him to see. This belonged to you, didn't it?" The man nodded slowly, his movement stiff and unnatural. His eyes never left the pendant. I took a cautious step forward, holding the pendant out toward him. "Here. You can have it back." But the moment the pendant left my hand, the man's expression twisted into something horrifying. His mouth opened wide, too wide, as if his jaw were unhinging, and an inhuman scream tore through the air. The sound was deafening, like nails on a chalkboard, and I stumbled back, covering my ears in a futile attempt to block it out. The forest around me seemed to come alive in response to the scream. The trees creaked and groaned, their branches twisting toward me like grasping hands. The fog thickened, swirling around me in a chaotic frenzy. And the ground beneath my feet began to tremble once again. I dropped the pendant in shock, and as soon as it hit the ground, the man's scream stopped. He stood there for a moment, his mouth still open, his eyes wide with terror. Then, without warning, his body collapsed into a pile of ash, blown away by the wind. I stared at the spot where he had been standing, my mind reeling. What the hell was going on? None of this made any sense. The pendant, the demon, the man, they were all connected. But how? And more importantly, what was I supposed to do now? I picked up the pendant again, hesitating for a moment before slipping it back into my pocket. As much as it terrified me, it was the only clue I had. I needed answers. And there was only one place I could think of to get them. The town. I had to go back. I turned and made my way back through the dense forest, following the faint path I had come down earlier. The moon, though still red, was fading, its eerie glow barely cutting through the thick fog. My breath came in short, sharp gasps, each step feeling heavier than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, though I saw no more shadows in the trees. The pendant in my pocket felt like it weighed a ton, pulling me down, reminding me of the strange encounter that had just occurred. As I approached the edge of the forest, the fog seemed to dissipate, the trees thinning out, and for a brief moment, I felt a sense of relief. I was almost out. Almost safe. But just as I thought I could relax, I heard something, soft whispers carried on the wind. They were faint, almost too quiet to hear, but they were there. Voices. I froze, turning in every direction, trying to pinpoint where they were coming from, but the forest was still. Nothing moved, and the fog seemed to cling to the trees like a silent audience, watching. Then, without warning, the whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if they were right beside me. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, but their tone was unmistakable, commanding, malevolent. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I broke into a run, not caring anymore where the path led, just desperate to escape the voices. As I burst out of the tree line, I found myself at the outskirts of the town. It was the same town I had driven through earlier that night, but something was wrong. The streets were empty, the lights in the houses flickering. A strange, oppressive energy hung in the air, thick and heavy, like the town was holding its breath. The silence was almost worse than the forest. Not a single car passed by, no voices, no distant hum of everyday life. It was as if the entire place had been abandoned, but I knew that wasn't true. I had seen people here only hours ago. I needed to find someone, anyone who could explain what was happening. But as I walked down the empty streets, I began to notice something even more unsettling. The red moon, though dimmer now, cast long shadows across the ground, but the shadows, they weren't right. At first, I thought it was just my tired mind playing tricks on me, but the more I looked, the more I realized that the shadows weren't matching up with the people or objects they should have belonged to. Some of the shadows moved independently, stretching and twisting in ways that defied logic. One shadow I saw had no source at all, just a dark figure standing alone in the middle of the street, cast by nothing. I picked up my pace, trying to shake off the dread creeping up my spine. I needed to get out of here. I needed help. Ahead, I spotted a small diner, the only building with its lights still on. I hurried toward it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, there would be someone inside who could help me make sense of all of this. As I reached the door, I noticed the neon sign above it flickering, the letters barely holding their glow. Inside, the diner was quiet, too quiet. The booths were empty, the counter abandoned. I walked in cautiously, the doorbell chiming loudly in the stillness. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing off the walls. "Is anyone here?" No answer. I stepped further in, feeling the weight of the pendant in my pocket, as if it was trying to pull me in another direction. But I ignored it, focusing instead on the eerie stillness around me. The place felt wrong, just like everything else in this cursed night. Suddenly, I heard a sound, a faint clinking, like the noise of a spoon tapping against a mug. My eyes darted to the back of the diner, where a lone figure sat at one of the booths. I hadn't noticed him before, but there he was, hunched over a cup of coffee, his back to me. "Hey," I called out, relief flooding me. "Do you know what's going on around here?" The figure didn't respond. I approached him slowly, the floor creaking beneath my feet. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. Something about the way the man was sitting, the stiffness in his posture, the way his head hung down, wasn't right. "Sir?" I asked, now only a few feet away. Still no response. I reached out a hand, ready to tap him on the shoulder, when he suddenly jerked upright. His head snapped back at an unnatural angle, and I gasped, stumbling backward in shock. His face, it wasn't a face at all. Just an empty void where his features should have been. No eyes, no nose, no mouth, just smooth, featureless skin stretched across his skull. I took another step back, my heart pounding in my chest as the faceless man slowly rose from his seat. He moved like a puppet on strings, his limbs stiff and jerky, as if he was being controlled by some invisible force. His head tilted toward me, though he had no eyes to see. Panic gripped me, and I bolted for the door, my hand fumbling for the handle. But as I pushed it open, I heard that same inhuman scream from before, the same one the man in the forest had let out when I dropped the pendant. It echoed through the diner, deafening and overwhelming, forcing me to cover my ears as I ran outside. The streets were no longer empty. Figures, like the one in the diner, stood in the shadows, lining the sidewalks. They had no faces, no expressions, just those same blank, featureless heads staring in my direction. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps, as the faceless figures began to move, slowly at first, then faster, closing in on me. What was happening? Where had they come from? And why were they following me? But deep down, I knew the answer. It was the pendant. It had to be. I couldn't keep it any longer. It was attracting these things, calling them to me like moths to a flame. But if I got rid of it, would they stop? Or would it only make things worse? I stumbled forward, my legs barely keeping me upright as I fled through the desolate streets. The faceless figures were getting closer. Every shadow seemed alive, twisting and bending toward me, their movements erratic, like they were tethered to some unseen force. I could hear them behind me, their steps growing louder, faster. My mind raced, trying to think of what to do. The pendant in my pocket felt hot now, almost burning against my skin. It pulsed with energy, as if it were alive, feeding off my fear. I had to get rid of it, but I didn't know how. I couldn't just throw it away. What if that made things worse? What if it wasn't enough? Suddenly, I spotted a small alleyway to my left, hidden between two old buildings. Without thinking, I darted into it, hoping to lose the figures in the maze of narrow passageways. The alley was dark, barely lit by the dim red glow of the moon overhead. Trash bins and broken crates littered the ground, but I pushed through, my breath ragged, my body trembling with exhaustion and fear. The air in the alley was thick, suffocating. Every breath felt like I was inhaling smoke, though there was no fire. My eyes darted around, searching for an escape route, but the walls seemed to close in on me, taller and more menacing with each step. I could still hear the figures behind me, their movements impossibly fast now, like they were gliding rather than walking. I reached a dead end. The alley was blocked by a tall chain-link fence, too high for me to climb in my current state. Panic surged through me, and I turned around, pressing myself against the cold, rough brick wall. My heart pounded in my ears, and my hand instinctively went to the pendant, clutching it tightly. The faceless figures appeared at the mouth of the alley, their blank heads turning in unison to face me. They stood still for a moment, watching, as if waiting for something. Then, one by one, they began to move, slowly advancing toward me. I was trapped. "Stay back." I yelled, but my voice was hoarse and shaky. "I don't know what you want, but stay away from me." They didn't stop. They just kept coming, their limbs moving unnaturally, their bodies contorting in strange, impossible ways. The closer they got, the more I could feel the air around me growing colder, thicker, as if reality itself was bending, warping under their presence. I had no choice. I had to try something. Anything. With trembling hands, I pulled the pendant out of my pocket. It felt even hotter now, almost too hot to hold. The strange symbols on its surface glowed faintly in the dim light, pulsing in time with my racing heartbeat. "Is this what you want?" I shouted, holding the pendant up for the figures to see. "Take it. Just leave me alone." But they didn't stop. In fact, they seemed to move faster now, as if drawn to the pendant, their featureless faces focused on it like moths to a flame. I had to act. I raised the pendant high above my head, ready to throw it to the ground, to smash it, to destroy whatever curse it held. But just as I was about to hurl it, a voice cut through the air. "Don't." It wasn't a whisper like before. This voice was clear, strong, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The figures stopped in their tracks, freezing in place as the voice echoed around me. "Don't destroy it," the voice repeated, softer this time, but no less commanding. "It's the only thing keeping them from taking you." I looked around wildly, searching for the source of the voice, but there was no one. Just the faceless figures, standing perfectly still, their heads tilted slightly, as if they were listening too. "Who are you?" I called out, my voice trembling. "What is this? What do they want?" There was a long pause, and for a moment I thought the voice wouldn't answer. But then it spoke again, low and somber. "They don't want the pendant. They want you." My heart skipped a beat, and a cold chill ran down my spine. "Why?" I whispered, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Because you touched it. You saw them. And now they'll never let you go." The weight of those words hit me like a sledgehammer, and I felt my knees buckle. I sank to the ground, the pendant still clutched in my hand, its warmth the only thing grounding me in the moment. What do I do?" I asked, my voice barely audible. The voice didn't answer right away. The silence stretched on, heavy and oppressive, until finally it spoke again. "Run." Before I could react, the figures started moving again, faster than before, their bodies twisting and contorting as they closed in on me. I scrambled to my feet, adrenaline surging through my veins, and I bolted back toward the alley's entrance, my mind racing. But this time, the figures didn't follow. They just stood there, watching, as I fled. I burst out of the alley and into the main street, gasping for breath as I glanced back over my shoulder. The faceless figures had vanished, but their presence lingered like a heavy fog in the air. The world around me felt surreal, as if I had stepped into a dream where reality twisted and turned under the weight of my fear. My heart raced as I pushed onward, desperate to find safety. The streets were eerily quiet now, the once vibrant sounds of the town muffled and distant. Shadows loomed large under the red moon, stretching and warping into sinister shapes that danced at the corners of my vision. I felt as if I were being watched, the very shadows themselves conspiring against me. I stumbled into the local diner, a place I often visited for late-night coffee and pie. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting a harsh glow that only amplified my anxiety. I could hear the faint clinking of dishes and the murmur of voices, but the diner was empty. I rushed to the counter, looking for some semblance of normalcy in the chaos surrounding me. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. "Is anyone here?" No response. I leaned against the counter, the cool surface grounding me for a moment. I took a deep breath, trying to collect my thoughts. I needed to figure out what was happening. I needed to understand why this was happening to me. The pendant still burned in my hand, a constant reminder of the chaos that had erupted in my life. I placed it on the counter, staring at it as if it held the answers to all my questions. What did it mean? Why did I have to touch it? Suddenly, the bell above the door jingled, breaking the silence. I whipped around, my heart racing again, only to see an elderly man enter the diner. He looked just as out of place as I felt, his eyes wide with confusion, glancing around as if he too were searching for something. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "More like 100 ghosts," I replied, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Something is wrong. It's the red moon. It's causing something. People are seeing things." He nodded slowly, his brow furrowing. "I know. I've heard the stories. They say that when the moon turns red, it opens a door to another world. A world filled with things we shouldn't see." "What do you mean?" I pressed, feeling a mix of hope and dread. "What kind of things?" "The ones who were lost. The ones who never made it back. They wander now, searching for a way to cross over. They can be angry or confused. Sometimes, they just want to be seen." A chill ran through me as his words sunk in. The faceless figures were just the beginning. They were part of something larger, something I couldn't fully comprehend. "How do we stop them?" I asked, desperation creeping into my voice. "How do we close this door?" The old man sighed, his shoulders sagging under the weight of knowledge. I don't know if it can be stopped, but there's a way to protect yourself. The pendant, what you hold there, it's a key. It can open doors, but it can also close them. You need to find a way to confront what you've unleashed. I nodded, my resolve hardening. I couldn't just run away. I had to face this. I had to find a way to put an end to it before it consumed me and everyone else in town. Just then, the pendant began to vibrate on the counter, its glow intensifying. I reached out to grab it, my heart pounding as a sudden sense of urgency washed over me. Something is happening, I said, looking back at the old man. I can feel it. The door swung open again, and this time, a group of people entered, their expressions filled with confusion and fear. They looked around, taking in the diner, the old man, and me. "What's going on?" one woman cried, her voice trembling. "We need to get out of here." "No," the old man said, stepping forward. "You can't run. It's already here." The atmosphere shifted as the diner filled with the palpable tension of impending doom. The shadows seemed to stretch and pull toward us, like fingers reaching out from the corners of the room. "We need to band together," I urged, looking at the faces around me. "If we're going to face this, we have to do it as a group." The woman nodded, her fear giving way to determination. "What do we do?" "We confront it," I said firmly, holding up the pendant. "We find the source of this curse, and we end it. Together." As I spoke, a low growl echoed from outside, resonating through the walls of the diner. It was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard, filled with malice and hunger. The shadows outside shifted violently, swirling around the windows, and I could see the faceless figures gathering just beyond the glass, their hollow eyes fixed on us. "Get ready," I whispered, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. "This is it. We face whatever comes." And then the door burst open, and the darkness spilled into the diner, a swirling mass of shadows and whispers rushing toward us as the world around me descended into chaos. As the darkness poured into the diner, a suffocating presence enveloped us. I could feel the cold air biting at my skin, and the shadows twisted into grotesque shapes, each one more terrifying than the last. The faceless figures loomed closer, their silent cries echoing in my mind. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to stay grounded. "Everyone, gather close," I shouted, instinctively moving towards the center of the diner. The group huddled together, their faces pale and eyes wide with fear. The elderly man stood beside me, his gaze fixed on the encroaching shadows. "What do we do?" one of the newcomers whispered, her voice trembling. "The pendant," I said, holding it up as it pulsed with an eerie light. "It's our only chance. It can either protect us or banish them." "Banish them?" the old man echoed. "Are you certain?" I nodded, trying to project confidence even as my insides twisted with doubt. "We have to try. We have to confront whatever this is. We need to focus on what we want." The shadows writhed around us, forming a swirling vortex of despair and rage. It was as if the darkness itself was alive, seeking to consume us. I could see glimpses of faces within the shadows, tormented souls reaching out, their expressions filled with anguish and longing. My heart ached for them, but I knew we couldn't allow them to take us too. "Think of what you want," I urged the group. "Picture it clearly. We want to be free of this curse. We want to banish the darkness." As we all closed our eyes and concentrated, I felt the energy in the room shift. The pendant grew warmer in my hand, its glow intensifying. I could sense a connection forming between us, a shared will that pulsed with power. Suddenly, the growl that had echoed earlier reverberated through the diner again, but this time it felt different. It was deeper, more primal, and it sent a jolt of fear straight through my spine. I opened my eyes, and what I saw sent my heart racing. A massive figure emerged from the darkness, its form twisted and grotesque. It loomed over us, eyes like burning coals, glowing with a hunger that chilled me to the bone. "Leave this place," it bellowed, its voice echoing like thunder. "You do not belong here. Stay together," I shouted, holding the pendant aloft. "We won't back down." The figure recoiled slightly, as if the light from the pendant stung its essence. I felt a surge of hope. "Focus," I commanded, feeling the strength of the group beside me. "We can do this." As we concentrated on the light of the pendant, I noticed the shadows retreating slightly, as if they were being pulled back by an unseen force. The monstrous figure snarled, frustration boiling over as it extended its hand towards us. I felt a surge of fear wash over me, but I pushed it aside. "Together," I urged, raising my voice above the din. "We can overcome this." With that, I closed my eyes and poured all my energy into the pendant, feeling it thrum with power. The light intensified, cutting through the shadows like a beacon. I could feel the presence of the others beside me, their hopes and fears intertwining with my own. The growling intensified, and the darkness pressed in on all sides, but I refused to give in. The pendant blazed with a brilliance that illuminated the entire diner, casting away the shadows that clung to us. Suddenly, the ground shook, and the dark figure screamed, a sound of pure rage and despair that echoed through the diner. I opened my eyes just in time to see the darkness fracturing, the swirling mass beginning to break apart. "Now!" I shouted, knowing this was our moment. "Banish it." We all raised our voices together, chanting words of unity, desperation, and hope. The pendant pulsed rhythmically, responding to our cries. The figure writhed and twisted, its form beginning to dissolve into the light. "No!" it roared, its voice filled with a mix of fury and anguish. "You cannot cast me out." But we were stronger together. The light of the pendant expanded, engulfing the figure completely. The shadows scattered, retreating like a tide pulled back from the shore. I could feel the weight of the darkness lifting, the air growing lighter around us. In one final burst of light, the figure let out a bone-chilling wail before it was consumed by the brilliance, and then silence fell over the diner. The shadows retreated completely, leaving us in the soft glow of the pendant, which now flickered gently in my hand. We stood there, panting, our bodies trembling from the energy we had unleashed. The elderly man looked around, disbelief etched on his face. Did we do it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. I nodded, though uncertainty lingered in my heart. "I think so. I think we pushed them back, but for how long?" The room felt different now, lighter, but an unsettling feeling nagged at me. The curse had been momentarily banished, but the memories of the dark figures and the growling beast lingered in my mind. As I looked around at the faces of those who had fought beside me, I realized we had forged a bond, a connection that went beyond the horror we had just faced. But even with that bond, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. "Let's get out of here," I suggested, my voice steadying. "We need to find somewhere safe, somewhere we can regroup." As we stepped out of the diner, the night air was still thick with tension. The red moon hung high above us, casting an eerie glow on everything it touched. I glanced back at the diner, a wave of relief washing over me. We had faced the darkness, and we had survived. But I knew deep down that the fight was far from over. As we made our way down the street, the pendant still glowing faintly in my hand, I could feel the weight of the night pressing on us. It wasn't over yet. The curse of the red moon lingered, and I had a sinking feeling that it would return. Suddenly, the pendant began to vibrate again, the light flickering as if sensing something I couldn't see. My heart raced as I exchanged worried glances with the others. "What's happening?" one of the newcomers asked, anxiety creeping into her voice. "I don't know," I admitted, tightening my grip on the pendant. "But I think we need to move. Now." Just as I spoke, the growling returned, louder and more menacing than before. A darkness spread across the street, and I could see the shadows creeping towards us, reforming into the shapes we had just banished. "We need to run," I shouted, adrenaline surging through me. But as we turned to flee, the shadows surged forward, engulfing us once again. The weight of despair crashed down, and I felt the darkness clawing at my mind, whispering doubts and fears. As we sprinted down the street, I could hear the echoes of laughter, taunting and cruel, rising from the shadows. It was as if the darkness was alive, mocking us for believing we could escape. "We're not going to make it," someone cried out, fear spilling into their voice. "Stay together," I shouted, desperate to maintain our unity. "We can fight this. We have to keep fighting." But as the shadows closed in, I could feel their presence overwhelming me. I was trapped in a web of fear and doubt, and I realized with horror that this time we might not escape. The growling morphed into a chorus of anguished voices, each one resonating with pain and loss. "You cannot hide from us. You will never escape." In that moment, I knew the truth. We had not banished the darkness. We had only delayed its return. The curse of the red moon had only just begun, and we were about to pay the ultimate price. As the shadows consumed us, I felt a sense of inevitability wash over me. This was the end. As the echoes of the distant whispers faded, a chill swept through the air, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. I stood frozen, heart pounding, my mind racing with the realization that the boundaries of reality were shifting. The veil between the living and the dead was wearing thin, and I was caught in the crossfire. I could see the shadows flickering at the edges of my vision, the silhouettes of the past rearing up, eager to reclaim what they had lost. It felt as though the very essence of the world around me was bending and distorting under the weight of the crimson moon. My fingers trembled as I reached for the small pendant that had belonged to my grandmother. It was supposed to offer protection, a talisman against the darkness. But now, it felt like a cruel joke. I glanced back towards the house. The walls that once felt familiar were now a labyrinth of horror. As I stepped closer, I felt an irresistible pull, as if the house itself was beckoning me to enter. With every step, the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, each one vying for my attention, each one a fragment of a story long forgotten. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, revealing a darkness that seemed alive. I hesitated, my mind screaming for me to run. But an unseen force urged me forward, and I crossed the threshold, plunging into the abyss. The inside of the house was transformed. Shadows twisted and danced on the walls, the air heavy with the scent of decay. As I moved deeper into the house, I stumbled upon a room I had never seen before. The walls were lined with mirrors, each one reflecting not just my image but also scenes from my past, moments I thought I had buried long ago. The laughter of friends, the warmth of family gatherings, all intertwined with glimpses of the horrors that haunted me. In one mirror, I saw the face of my childhood friend, Sarah, who had vanished years ago. Her eyes were wide with terror, and she mouthed a silent scream, reaching out to me. My heart ached at the sight. I pressed my palm against the cold glass, a desperate attempt to connect, to save her. But the moment my skin touched the surface, a jolt of energy surged through me, and the mirrors began to ripple like water. The room twisted, and I was pulled into the glass, tumbling through a void that felt like eternity. I landed on a cold, hard floor, disoriented and breathless. Around me stood the figures of the lost, their faces twisted in anguish, each one trapped in a reflection of their final moments. I recognized each one, friends, family, even strangers who had crossed my path. They all looked at me with a mixture of sorrow and anger, as if blaming me for their fate. I wanted to scream, to tell them I wasn't responsible, but no words came. Instead, I felt their pain seep into me, an overwhelming tide of grief and despair. Then, a voice broke through the silence, smooth and cold. "You've always been drawn to the darkness, haven't you? You wanted to know what lies beyond, and now you will join them." It was a voice I recognized, one I had hoped to never hear again, the voice of my grandmother, twisted by the shadows that now surrounded us. With horror, I realized the truth. The pendant hadn't protected me, it had been a key. My desire to uncover the mysteries of the past had opened the door to the realm of the damned. I was destined to wander this endless maze of sorrow, like those before me. Just as the shadows closed in, I felt a surge of defiance. I wouldn't give in. I wouldn't let them take me. With a fierce determination, I focused on the pendant and whispered a desperate prayer, calling upon the memories of love and laughter that had once filled my life. The shadows recoiled, their hold loosening as light flickered around me. But then, in an unexpected twist, the mirror shattered, the pieces falling like rain. Instead of freeing me, the shards revealed the truth. I was not just a victim, I had become a warden of this realm. The realization struck me like lightning. I was to oversee the spirits trapped here, forever caught between worlds, destined to guide the lost and the damned. And as I stood there, watching the figures I once knew fade into the darkness, I understood that the curse of the Crimson Moon was not just about the horrors of the night, but also about the burden of memories, both cherished and haunting. I had become a guardian of their stories, tethered to the house and its shadows for eternity. The echoes of their whispers filled the air once more, and I knew that while I had escaped the physical grasp of the curse, I would forever be bound to it. The red moon shone brightly outside, a reminder of the night that had changed everything, a cycle that would repeat with each passing generation. And deep down, I understood that some doors were never meant to be opened. As the last vestiges of the crimson glow faded from the sky, I turned towards the door, ready to embrace my new reality, the weight of fate heavy on my shoulders. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.